All right, we're recording. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, class of anthropology, anthro-human comparison today, because I want to talk to you about comparative anthropologies, urban anthropologies in comparative frame. I'm going to tell you the date. It's the 22nd of December. I'm sure you know that, but you know, for the recording. And this is class 302113. This is the 14th lecture in the series, and we have one more after this, which will be a revision, so probably won't record it, or at least broadcast the recording. And I'm talking about comparative turns, which is sort of the trouble with intellectual work in the published journal arena and so on is that if you're not having a turn, if you're not having something new that's transforming your discipline, what are you doing? You've got to have the next new thing. So one attempt at talking about the next new thing in the mid 2010s was the comparative turn. We've already talked about the writing culture turn, and then there was a turn to structuralism. There was a turn to turn this, turn that. Ontological turn was a big one when people started to read Heidegger and talk about trees. And the turn to animals was a minor turn, but it was important. And maybe there's an environmental one on the cards. Anyway, some studies recently of historical, cultural, and heritage urbanism began to ask questions of comparative knowledges of the city in a global framework, challenging our conventions, or they said they were challenging our conventions of narrative and scale. By scale, I suppose what's a challenge for that in anthropology is the idea that anthropology is very local and site-specific. And then here was a call for taking that site-specific to the level of the global and doing comparative work. The people leading this were really Ananya Roy and Jennifer Robinson. But you can also read Mukherjee, Laura Baer, very interesting, Brett Nielsen, Ned Rossiter, and Samada. They introduced a different kind of term, perhaps, but I want to talk about them in relation to a comparative term. They talked about logistics, and we're in kind of culture studies, but it's really of importance for anthropology. Anyway, this is a comparative term that tries to challenge how we tell stories in anthropology and say it's not just local, it's always comparative. And do you remember I talked about this in relation to Evans Pritchard, because he raised the issue of comparative and said that we're always doing comparison. But now there was an attempt to consciously make this comparison a framework for urban anthropology, and that you would look at one location and scale up to the global and look at another location that was comparative, similar. How would you do that? Well, there are lots of discussions about that. Do you take the model of the street or the community, the suburb, the enclave, the shopping center? So many, like you compare a shopping center in, Midwest America with one in a medium town in, Delhi or India or somewhere. There are lots of reasons for thinking that will be interesting and lots of reasons for thinking that's a bit mad, because, cultural issues, context, relationship to global capital and supply chains, all will be somewhat different. The logistics, all will be somewhat different. Maybe tracking the differences would be interesting. My question for this is a little bit different, though. My criticism of this is a little bit different because I'm interested more in, I think maybe it's that we've been going about it the wrong way, or they're going about it the wrong way by talking about let's change to a comparative turn. But I think that in urban planning, they can't, maybe the question is wrong, to start to look at radical different comparative methodologies without actually looking at who it is that's doing the comparative work, right? And that without really taking the opportunity to rethink who gets to do urban planning or any kind of comparative work in this context, without really thinking of a really inclusive and responsive approach to the communities, missing the point. So my question is, who gets to do comparative studies? So I want to take this comparative turn literature and alongside some literature on inclusive methodologies to ask this question. So inclusive methodologies, what do we mean by that? They proliferate as well. There are many. There are studies that claim or promote the idea of some kind of dialogue with the people who are the studied, right? So I've mentioned already Kevin Dwyer and his book Moroccan Dialogues, and he's written a book in dialogue with the fakir in Morocco, and it wasn't in Sidi Laken, but I can't remember the town. But in that study, Kevin Dwyer was still the author, the controlling voice in a way, even though he foregrounds the voice of the fakir, the gentleman with the local knowledge. It's still Kevin Dwyer who adds the footnotes and so on. But still, there was an attempt to call that an inclusive methodology. There are other versions where people use, here comes the drilling on cue. There are other versions where people use mapping, and I've done this, and I'm still interested in this, getting people to make maps of their community, all right, and that's linked to a what's called participation model, prospective, active, and reflective. Participation, getting the people who know the local to participate in the research, but quite often they're not. Well, I'd say, ask the question, are they really fully participant? Ingram, Karuna, McCabe, people like that. There are approaches that focus on community vulnerability, recognizing that the people in the communities that are studied don't have the resources to resist intrusions by planners, by anthropologists, by everyone. And if you foreground their vulnerability, you have to write a bit differently about them. Right? So Sullivan Wiley, Gianotti and Connors, for example, not 2 years ago, writing about this, were interesting. There are scholar advocate angles, right? This is more activist oriented, the scholar advocate in urban geography, Cope, Danley. They take up the cause of the local community, right? As people with a voice in academic media and who can put forward the local community's interests. There's a set of works that in inclusive methodologies that say, in the first place, the people are first. Their associations, their identities, the kind of what's called a heteroglossic affirmation. Their variety must be respected. There's a strong movement in the last 8 years or so, 9 years, maybe 10 years for decolonizing epistemologies. I mean, I first started to see this stuff in around about 2000, actually, when a book about dolphins was proposed. Dolphin methodologies was proposed for a publisher, and I was asked to review it, which I did. And it took a long time to get it published for some reason, I don't know why. But that was, and based in New Zealand, it was really focused on local knowledges. So there's this challenge to, and Anne Salmon's work was important for this, challenge to the knowledge structure of the publishing industries, focus on the West, Euro-American, and other frames of thinking might be promoted, pushed, right? I mean, there was always an interest of anthropology in some sense. Then there are inclusive methodologies that use new technologies. So, for example, putting cameras in the hands of the people who are being studied and letting them take photographs or make film or shoot film anyway, which is then curated and put up by Cederholm and people like that. Putting the informant in charge of the situation and the story she wants to tell, as was mentioned by Cederholm, as well as participatory methods discussions that challenge the leadership of participatory projects, like why should the research team leader be the one that says what's of interest in the research? And yet we still had teams, we still had research projects, right? So inclusive methodologies anyway has a long history and has not yet solved its philosophical problems, because books are still published by professors who lead research teams, and they talk about inclusive methodologies, but they are the ones who get to talk about them. So bringing that into the question of comparative urban anthropology maybe is interesting. So debates about this comparative turn are equally enthusiastic about, they have a kind of frisson of excitement about challenging, updating, and renewing urban planning scholarship. Glick Schiller and Aisha Shaglar are big on this. Peck, very, but it's still Robinson and Roy that have been leading, calling for really new work and challenges and so on, and yet then sometimes not publishing things that do challenge them, by the by. So I want to turn the inclusive methodology debate, folded into this discussion of what is call for new approaches and renewal of urban studies, urban anthropology, urban planning. And turn these debates towards the perspective of the present by asking, who now is it that gets to compare the urban? Who's working in urban studies? And what are the consequences of that? And use this to contribute to try and contribute to discussion about the very difficulties of involving usually disenfranchised so-called participants in knowledge production and using them as researchers themselves. What if we tried to do that? And then what are the difficulties? Because there are some big difficulties, actually. So we're interpreting cultural heritage, we're interpreting cultural change, questions of policy, urban life, comparatively. This is the first question I want to ask. Who does this challenging? Who does this comparison? Is it still the self-proclaimed heroic anthropology professor that's going to rethink everything? Or is it somehow the local community, the residents of an area that someone's decided there's a subject of research, the community that hosts the research that's designed to tell us, the global readership, about these particular lives, and to do so in comparative scope, right? So here in participatory mode, in wider sense, it's the members of the community who probably are the best placed to compare, because they know and understand the logics and logistics of the cities, of the communities in which they live. Okay, Now, they are best placed to talk about where they live. Aren't they then the ones that should do the comparative work? Right. So why is it that someone empowered by some other protocols, getting a PhD, being in charge of a research team, having the funding, why is it that they get to compare? Not, if we're going to talk about inclusive methodologies and include the local people in producing the text about them, because they're the ones that know about them, why aren't they also the ones that, right? So members of the community in the widest sense are best placed to compare, right? And they know the logistics of the cities in which they live. And these people are the ones to which surely comparative insights will come as part of a larger project that challenges ownership and management of knowledge. Because challenging that credentializing of scholarship, that, you know, it's only highly rated professors that get to compare, should be a criteria of decolonizing knowledge or participatory methods, or really rethinking the comparative turn. So from a really local perspective, we can critique the normative assumptions about who produces knowledge. That's the step one in research about urban heritage. And that is then the basis for involving and then indeed employing, because that's the big issue, the knowledge creating place-making groups that are most adversely affected by regeneration projects or heritage development, and have them lead comparative urban knowledge projects by seeking like-minded or similarly situated confreres elsewhere, like people that are also place-making groups most affected by regeneration in one place, and be put with, lots of communication technologies that can make this happen now, put with similar place-making adversely affected by regeneration groups in another place. So I make a proposal, and I made a proposal for my research 2 years ago, which only Tonduk Tang funded. It was talked about by 7 other applications. It was talked about really favorably by all sorts of funding agencies and reviewers in Europe, but none of them actually came up with the money. So, because it's, the money is an issue, big issue. But the key proposal was to not specify in advance what would be comparative, what the comparative would throw up, but to include in a structural or even infrastructural institutional way, with compensation, with proper salaries. This is the sticking point. The local communities who would participate in would in fact do the research, right? Taking it really seriously, that what's determined by the participants as local particular concerns was the topic of the research, right? So this experiment was following Robinson and Roy, their enthusiasm for imaginative studies that would chart experiments and initiatives of unruly and creative intervention to transform, dislodge and divert the conventions of urban studies. I'm also inspired by the work of Abu Malik Simon. He's some great books, and his project is inspiring insofar as he seeks out what the city doesn't really show, what gets covered up and what's prohibited and kept from people's attention by otherwise normative and spectacular conventions, right? That move the messy and complicated local issues of labor and politics out of the story, because the story should, conventionally tells a coherent narrative from the point of the single speaker the professor talking about the people in the city, right? But actually things are a lot messier than that. And there are many different interpretations of the same thing. And maybe if there was technologies and methods and ways of putting groups together so they could articulate their understanding of the city, the local community understanding of the city, and that could be put onto the into the narrative, not by a controlling narrator, but just put forward in some way, we will maybe get the new the comparative turn that Roy and Robinson wants. It might not be that this achieves such work, the new typology for comparative methods based on vernacular practices of urban comparison that Robinson wants, but then that's what an unruly disruption of standard analysis and bias will do. It will go in unpredicted directions, and it may fail, may not work, it may not be ever acceptable in some weird sense. So what I want to do is I want there to be included disenfranchised, disaffected groups within the organisation of research. But this is a really difficult thing to, even first of all, to articulate and then to get people behind, right? Because it's not simply to line up with those who prophesied the commercialization of all aspects of social science research long ago, right? It can be. I mean, one of the dangers is that there's a claim that bringing all parts of the city and everyone into the documentation project of the university feeds into, especially in urban planning, the management of communities by experts in the employ of government and basically corporations. This is an instrumentality, an administrative instrumentality that's really malignant. That the more we know, even of the unruly, the more the authorities have knowledge about the deviant or the marginal or the informal, the illicit, the illegal, in order to better police those communities. So there's a danger built in to this kind of project, because the comparative turn and inclusive methodologies are both now operating in an environment where the university is more and more commercialized, and more the talk is of how knowledge must serve not explicitly commercial interests and not explicitly government, but knowledge must show its relevance and show its real world practicalities, and it can't just be abstract knowledge for the sake of it. And here's the danger: like, does talking about the need for local communities to have a say in what knowledge is produced about them, not sort of at the same time draw them into the institutional apparatus which collects knowledge about them and will benefit from documenting their points of view in an enclosed way, like, to have their points of view on the table, all the better to argue against them or to contain them or to discipline them. So, like, maybe it's the case that local communities or illicit workers or something like that, deviant workers, don't want the knowledge about their lives to be documented and available for governance. But can they even have a say in this? If somebody's saying, oh, you've got to put your perspective into the discussion, can they have a say in what happens to that knowledge? Because it's used in so many different ways. And no, they can't, because knowledge as such gets used by anyone and everyone. And of course, corporations and governments are in the business of using knowledge to help their policy and planning. And not all governments and not all corporations are, working in the best interests of the community. Some are, no doubt. Yeah, really good government, excellent. Really good company, excellent. But honestly, the majority are interested in their voters in democracies and their shareholders in corporations. That's the bottom line. And what they actually do is like just damage control to make sure that they can look after those two criteria, getting re-elected and keeping the shareholders happy. Everything else is somehow window dressing. So they could use this talk about inclusive methodologies as a kind of research greenwashing, or it wouldn't be greenwashing then, would it? It's not environmental, but it's sort of, it's not whitewashing. It's more like heteroglossia washing. It's making out that they're all inclusive when in fact their bottom line still remains the same. So there's that set of problems. The other set of problems I already mentioned, how do you pay for researchers who are, not credentialized in the same way as those that are trained. I've done a BA and then an MA and then a PhD, and any unruly elements have been cleaned up, tidied up, knocked off in the formation of shaping a university researcher. Any kind of wild aspects are cleaned up. So what the institution thinks about paying research salaries to people who haven't been through that apprenticeship is of course difficult. And of course, and researchers who have been through that apprenticeship, and it's a long apprenticeship, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, they're going to necessarily, of course they should ask questions about preferential or not preferential, allocation of resource to people who haven't been through that apprenticeship. Of course, you chose to go through the apprenticeship rather than struggle on the streets like these people did. It's not a choice, of course. And the position of a researcher in the university is also always one of a certain privilege. So when that privilege gets challenged and distributed differently, privilege, of course, gets upset. So this is part of the comparative turn, or how I would talk about the comparative turn. And it's a really broad brush, I know. And to take it up now, well, it's also at a time when a lot of institutional radicalism is tamed. I think it's important to still hang on to the tentative and uncertain, messy aspects of any approach that recognizes that learning is a difficult process of mutuality. And the question still is there whether the cracks opened by this comparative turn, this gesture, are open enough to permit inserting inclusive methodologies in a way that's wholly speculative, but can challenge that privilege of those who do comparative work. Now, I want to really get some focus on this, so I'm going to talk more specifically about my research project, and it's set in Bengal and in London at the same time. That's the comparison. But its framing is really goes back to Marx, of course, right? But a specific part of Marx's critique of the learned professors of the East India Company who taught here at Haileybury College in London. And Marx, when he talks about the learned professors, he's mocking them. They were here at the East India College. Richard Malthus, not Richard Malthus, Richard Jones, Professor Richard Jones, and Malthus, Pop Malthus, were really prominent professors who taught the officials of the East India Company to go and administer India, basically. So the East India College was in Hertford and Hertfordshire in England, and it was founded in 1806, and it was the training school for the Honourable East India Company, which had begun in 1600 and was still up until 1857 was the governing power in India, right? A company, not the British government. British government took over with Queen Victoria in 1857, but from 1600 to 1857, the Indian colonial project was run by a company called the East India Company, the Honourable East India Company, or as it was known in shorthand, John Company. Actually, I don't know why it was called John Company. John Bull, I guess, the model of English, the Britisher. In January 1858, after the Indian Rebellion that Marx writes about as well, in 1857, the British government in 1858 took over the administration of India, and the college was closed. Right, but up until then, it was closed as a school just temporarily. It became Haileybury College, and it became the college that looked after, eventually it became the Imperial Services College. So it still trained everyone who ran colonialism. But up until 1858, it had been the training site for East India Company officials. And Capital is full of all these references to the East India Company and to these professors, right? Who were sycophants and plagiarists. I mean, the insults that Marx throws their way are hilarious. But he really wants to critique their ideas of political economy and show that they haven't understood capital at all. And they do so because they're basically working in the interests of the East India Company. I mean, he doesn't express it in that way, but it's clear that they are. He also has another line that I want to follow that's really crucial, where he criticizes and mocks the use of opiates, in keeping the working class of both India and Britain down, keeping them in subjection. Right? And that was through the smoking of opium in India. Okay, so opium pipes, not just India, of course, all across Asia, but workers were paid sometimes in opium. And of course, the Chinese were sold wholesale. The drug was peddled to them because there was the British were very keen to replace their expenditure in silver for tea with some other trade items, so they grew opium. They replaced a lot of rice production for opium production and impoverished the Indian population. But they also kept the workers sedate, right, after the rebellion especially. I mean, you can also see this in the case for Vietnam. If you read everything from Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence in August 1945, where he talks about how the French have, kept the Vietnamese people under destroyed them with alcohol and drugs, and took them opium right through to I don't know, you go down to the posh so-called colonial heritage restaurants in Hai Ba Trung Street, number 74. You can see the old French opium factory has been turned into a upmarket touristy set of restaurants, a courtyard. Anyway, so there's a Vietnam story to be told there as well. But I'm talking about India. Both Indian workers in India who were made to both grow opium and who smoked it, of course, and that makes you, I guess, was seen as a way of pacifying workers, making them work harder, making them less likely to rebel. And in Britain, in the form of laudanum or paregoric, opium was mixed with like a syrup, alcohol, and used to, well, both Marx and Disraeli mention Godfrey's cordial as a kind of paregoric or laudanum in their respective works. So Marx in Capital and Disraeli, the Prime Minister, future Prime Minister of England, in his novel Sybil. I don't have a picture of Godfrey's cordial, but I have this similar stick, knee, and pause paregoric. The word paregoric comes from the Greek word paragorikon, which was originally applied to oratory, to rhetoric, a particular form of speech, which was really about the distraction of attention. Right, that's the predominant feature of this paragorikon kind of speaking, right? And then this word passed through different shades of meaning, like it consoles or soothes, and it finally came to have the same significance as anodyne, as pacifying, right? And there was it had an expectorant action. And it was, you know, a really big business selling, right, like it was a vast company selling opium to the working class in Britain so that the workers found some distraction or some soothing relief after having worked so hard, 16 hours a day and so on. Or Godfrey's cordial was given to children so that mothers could work with their children like asleep, basically knocked out beside them while they worked. And the trouble with this stuff is that opium was suspended in a liqueur, and if you didn't shake the bottle, you know, most medicine still says shake well. That's because if you didn't shake the bottle, after giving spoon after spoon of this paregoric, the opium, if it's sitting on the shelf, the opium condenses down the bottom. So the spoonfuls that come from the bottom of the jar will be much more potent, much stronger, and cause death and addiction and terrible things. So this is part of the reason why Marx is so critical of the professors of the Haileybury College and the East India College School. It was called the East India College School because they promoted how, you know, the project of colonialism as this mission of Britain to civilize the heathens and so on, and yet they were basically sending scholars out to join a colonial army, which did collect knowledge, and comparative knowledge was a big part of it, but which really did so as a secondary tool for its frontline military project, right? And you know about the opium wars and against China, and you know, it's really astonishing that if you go to museums in the UK, you can find a little bit about the opium wars, but they are not the main story, and you don't hear about, say, in Greenwich Museum. This is actually from the Cutty Sark, a ship that's turned into a museum in Greenwich, this photograph, where there's one tea chest on which the story of the Opium Wars is mentioned. And in the Greenwich Maritime Museum, not far away, there's this exhibit called the Trader's Wing, and there's brief mention of opium in the, you can't quite read the text here, but there's one mention of opium in the very last sentence, almost as an afterthought. But it has the irony of innuendo that perhaps escaped the curators of this exhibition here. The taste is a slang, is slang for a hit of opium, right? So here it says, Chinese porcelain came into Britain with the tea trade, including a new world of design. At the same time, the tea trade had a darker side. The company used illegal opium to fund its tea business, right? A taste of China. So a taste is to have a hit of opium. But, you know, it focuses on the main story as the tea. It doesn't mention the wars, which were completely devastating and a slaughter, right? And it doesn't discuss the fact that opium was the #1 commodity in this trade. It talks about tea. Like if you wandered through these museums, you thought, oh, there was this little thing about opium, but mainly it was about tea and porcelain and all the wonderful objects of the colonial booty, right? Go back to the picture, hang on a sec. There's teacups and the ships, the heroic age of sail and so on. But really it was opium, it was drug peddling, basically. And yeah, the East India Company had monopoly on the growing of opium in Bihar, and I used to have a map of, I should have shown you the map of where it was growing, because all over the colonial farming, the settlement of British settlement in India, wherever they were, huge tracts of land were given over to products other than food, not rice. So in some places, indigo, the material that creates the dye that dyed your jeans blue, like the reason you have blue jeans is because of indigo farming in India, which replaced food production, and opium, which funded the British trade with China to get tea, right? And this is all by way of context. I mean, you can think of also how Vietnam was a part of this story, because many of those sailing with opium from India to China, to Canton, to give the Chinese opium, stopped off on the way, because a halfway point was the East India Company base at Con Dao in Vietnam, although that didn't last very long, and the East India Company bases in Penang, Singapore, Bencoolen, other parts of Malaysia and Indonesia, and even sometime in Hoi An, Hanoi, those areas. But a part of the story of resistance of Vietnam is that the Wing Kings also kicked out the British, right? So it's not just defeated the French, the Japanese, the Americans. Even earlier, the Wing Kings in 1705 got rid of the British. 1705, yeah, 1705. I've written about this story, so it's not even told in the History Museum in Con Dao, but it should be, because it's all right. Maybe it's not a palatable story, because basically instead of just defeating them and having them go home, like, I don't know, Americans went home or the French went home, or, the British were wiped out to a man, only one survivor from the settlement in Con Dao. Catchpole was the leader, and there was only one person left alive after the Wing Kings hired Macquarie's soldiers or workers to rise up against the British and basically massacre them. I mean, I don't think the Wing King said kill them all, but the effect was kill them all. Anyway, the point is that this role of opium in British colonialism is not evident. And so I wanted to do research that would really put that as part of the framework. And that meant I worked always in Calcutta, and Calcutta is a city that's the city of governance of colonial power. It was the capital of British India until 1911. But really the story of opium is up the road, because the British were made to feel a bit guilty about the opium trade, right? Clive, the ruler of Bengal who took over, he had started the opium trade, not mentioned in many of the books. He ends up also, I mean, Marx writes about this, committing suicide with opium, using opium, because he was drummed out of the British establishment long after he was the hero, but then later. And then the companies that traded on opium, including like a massive company, Matheson Jardine Matheson, and they founded the P&O, helped found the P&O sailing company, and Hutchinson Whampoa, I'll talk about that company a bit later. Mega corporations that are in Hong Kong today, right? These companies were the traders in opium, because the East India Company, while it controlled and had a monopoly of the production, it at the same time was made to feel like, because of the Quakers and others that recognized that growing recognition that opium was dangerous and bad for workers in Britain, they moved the trade. They still profited from the trade, but they moved the trade into these holding companies. I mean, the profits from the opium trade made fortunes, huge fortunes, and they earned revenues for the East India Company and the British government, because the British government taxed the East India Company. But and this paid for the administration of the empire, basically, and financed Royal Navy costs and so on. And this led to the Opium Wars. The Chinese tried to halt the trade in the drug, and then Palmerston was and Lord Melbourne were in Lord Melbourne's government was persuaded by the company Jardine Matheson to basically go to war in 1839 to force the Chinese to accept the trade. And the 3-year war led to the Treaty of Nanking, and basically the transfer of the territory of Hong Kong. This is why Hong Kong was British until 1997. It's because it goes back to the 1839 Opium War. Right now, but feeling so they're complicit in this opium trade, but they also feeling guilty about it. So that's why they had these companies, and the government could keep it kind of separate from actually doing the trade. It controlled the production. The East India Company and then the government controlled the production of opium. So East India Company person wasn't allowed to sell opium, but anyone who bought opium could only buy East India Company opium. So what happened was that when East India Company officials who had preferential access to the sale of opium, because it was East India Company opium, when they wanted to go into business, they had to pretend that they were not part of the East India Company, and they set up separate entities. Jardine Matheson, for example, and set themselves up as consuls and all sorts of positions outside of the formal East India Company or the British Raj, and they even based themselves often outside of Calcutta in the jurisdiction of the Danish, who were there up the road in a city called a settlement called Serampore. So from 1755 to 1845, the Danish were based in Serampore, which is like a famous site where there's a university and the first university in Asia. And the missionary Carey, William Carey, was based there, because the British also they felt guilty about missionaries as well. They didn't want missionaries stirring up the natives as well. But the Danish king said, well, you can stay in our part of India, right? So there's a church there, and recently these places are being renovated by a Danish company. They're interested, the Danish Museum in Copenhagen is interested in excavating this nearly 100-year period of Danish settlement in India, and restoring the Ole Bears Church, the government building, and the gate. And I mean, basically, it was a Danish port, and all these ships were working out of there in what's called country trade, the non-East India Company trade, the outside trade, where British EIC officials did work on the side, and basically they shipped opium to China and their profits home to Britain, right? So you didn't send your profits home on a British ship, you sent it on a Danish ship. And it's documented, a really great book by, keep on turning around because it used to be just behind me, it's over there now, by Feldbeck. Tracked these ships and noted that most of them sailed to Copenhagen but didn't unload their cargo there. They went on to London because it was the booty, the riches of the East India Company officials sent under kind of consignment, not through official channels, back home to Britain. Anyway, the renovation by the Danish government includes things like, I don't know, one curious thing, and this is where I get down to paying attention to the locals in this research. Locals, when I was there, they said, oh, look, they're renovating this back gate, and they dragged me around to this place where they called it the Tanner, right? And it's part of the compound of the government house. They took me first to the gate, and I thought, they're renovating this? I mean, this gate doesn't look like much. And, you know, okay, it did remind me of some places, and I think I'll be able to show you that a bit later on. As a kind of part of a fortress wall around the British, the Danish compound. I thought, yeah, okay, oh, that's history. You know, Serampore is really interesting. It's the Danes, and like the British, when they set up to trade in Bengal, they had different kinds of markets than the local markets that existed under the Mughals, and because the market for the Indian market, so to speak, right, before colonialism, was a very open ground where anyone could come, and it was usually also it was a mela, it was a religious festival and a market, right? And the company, East India Company market, and the other colonial powers, the Dutch, the Danish, the French, when they set up a market, they were very concerned about control and pilfering. They didn't want any. They wanted to make sure that their goods were held, that no one could come into the market without paying the price, and there was taxation for transporting goods and so on. And they built these fortress walls, these mini compound and fortresses around their compounds to kind of contain the market. So markets were brought into, into markets rather than being just part of the mela, part of the religious festival. Right? And that was a significant and interesting change. Right? I mean, aside from the other things in Serampore that are important, like I know the university. So William Carey was incredibly important in translating. Well, basically in 30 years or so, he translated, I don't know, the Bible into 30 different languages, Indian languages, right? To William Carey and some other missionaries, Marshman, William Ward. They're part of the Baptist Missionary Society, and they were translating the Bible into Indian languages to promote Christianity, right? I think it's 45 printed different languages into which they translated the Bible between 1800 and 1832. So at the high point of the opium trade, there was also this missionary Bible work, and they sent these Bibles out with missionaries all over. Carey himself had translated the Bible into 10 languages and taken them along to the different communities, right? So, and then there's Ole Bears Church, and this is a picture of it when it's being renovated. It's not far from the compound. It's kind of basically a part of the Danish government compound. And it's modelled on a church in the centre of London, right there at Trafalgar Square, St. Martin's in the Field. And it's where the Baptist missionaries operated, right? Never any Danish missionary. The sign on it during the renovation, you can just see at the bottom of the pillars, and I've got a close-up. This church building is not safe. I think all church buildings are not safe. But anyway, by the by. But they also renovated the government house, which also had pillars, and here's some shots. This is the 1771 government house, built by Johann Leonard Fix. Brick building, a hall with 2 rooms and a veranda, and in the classic style. And it's been renovated by an anthropologist called Bente Wolf, in charge of this project for the Copenhagen State Museum. It's called the Serampore Project. This is out the back. And they're also renovating that gate, right? I showed you the gate. This is what they have from the original photographs of the gate. This is from a report by Fleming Allund and Simon Raston from 2010. They researched what the gate looked like. So it's really significantly different. Right, here's another photograph of it. Right. And you see the building at the back that's gone. In this picture, you can see the government house in the back and its pillars. And then on the other end, and this is the bit that local people took me to, when I started wandering around this gate, the locals said, look, they're also renovating the Tanna. And I'm going, Tanna, I know that word. What's that? That's police station, isn't it? What's the police station? And what the Danish were renovating was this building out the back of the government house called the back gate. Right? And it was built originally as the 2 rooms that would have a storage and reception role for the government house. But as was said to me by locals, these people that I ended up working a lot with, they said, this is the Tanna. You can't go there. Don't go there. It's haunted. Right? There are ghosts. And I spoke with the others, and they said, no, don't know what that's about. This was the Danish, the gatehouse for the officials that looked after the grounds. It was part of the compound of the market and the grounds of government house for the Danish. But it turns out that this back gate, so-called back gate, when the Danish left, and the Danish were, they sold up basically, they sold out to the British in 1845, the British took over the back gate and used this building as a police station to a guardhouse and detention facility. And they basically, the ghosts that the local people know about and the Danish people didn't know about, and they were renovating it, were the ghosts of revolutionaries that were killed by the British. They were hung by the British police, basically, inside this building. And the Danish want to turn this into a coffee shop, and for the renovated government house, which they want to make into a museum, the back gate they want to turn into a coffee shop. And the local people are going, no one will want coffee in that house. They're ghosts, right? And not only that, it is definitely a stark aspect to it. But at the back of it, there's also, this is the back side of that gate, there was a row of shops, and the Danish group have torn down the shops, all but one. This guy who's selling pan, a kind of betel nut compound that you chew, mildly narcotic. And one trader had not moved on from the stall out the back, and they're basically trying to clear them all away. And these are the people that told me about the Tana. It's a police station, and it's full of these ghosts. All right, so the facade, smoking kills. It's in the photograph. So it's not just smoking that kills. It's being a revolutionary is kill. Anyway, these buildings were just outside the otherwise ruined back gate. And the front gate, that's the first one we looked at, that's also there. So let me talk about the Tana, though. The Serampore initiative wants to repair this gatehouse as part of the compound. It's now a beautiful building again. They've done the renovation wonderfully. They've done it in using traditional materials, which is lime and egg, render, and so on. And they used local traders, and they had to move the traders from the roadside stalls, but they used local techniques. But there was this resentment at there being displacing the traders, but also against anyone who had the idea of entering a building of ghosts. The Tana is remembered as a traumatic space of British colonial violence. And here's the thing about heritage projects, and this is what is interesting that the locals are saying. Why are they renovating the project to its Danish period when it's not problematic, when the real history of this that matters to us is under the British, when this was a site where they killed local revolutionaries? Right? So this is a problem with all renovation projects. If a building's had multiple uses, to what point do you make the renovation? Do you renovate back to its original or its significant moment? Or do you try and keep them all? I mean, and how? How would you do that? So, yeah, I haven't yet, and with local researchers, we were trying to get into the archives and document these several hangings that are said to have taken place, and we haven't managed to, and of course COVID and the pandemic kind of put a stop to that so far. But yeah, there's really a big issue of paying attention to what the locals would like, what local people would make as knowledge, and what the Danish government or the Danish museum, coming back to its old colonial possession, like 150 years later, with money, to make Denmark look like it's, had this lovely colonial buildings that it built, right? When in fact it was trading opium on behalf of the British East India Company officials doing a side trade. Basically, they were the whole city was a drug port, right? And missionary activity, the same. I mean, you can make a nice gate, and they've done a beautiful job of the gate, as you can see. Look at it. It's so much better than, let me go back to the photo of the old gate. Hang on, I should be able to do that. All right, so this is how it was when I first visited, and then the historical picture of it. And this, and how they renovate it, which is pretty close. Not exactly the same. They've not put the crown on the top. All right, you see, let's go back. The Danish crown and flag on the top. They've kept the triangle, but they've not put the crown and the flag. But they've done a beautiful job and the render of traditional materials and so on. Although they had to move the traders away here, they kept the old tree because that's got aesthetic. There's kind of banyan tree here with all the, but they've got rid of the traders. I don't know whether you can't see the traders in the old post there. Or here, basically it was a bus station. Right, it was like you would catch bus or rickshaws out the front. Anyway, they cleaned it up, and they've done this beautiful job. But here's the question: do you renovate to its original format, or do you renovate with what it became? And of course, the Danish wouldn't be interested in renovating it to the British period, because that's not them, and the British aren't renovating it because it was not. They used it as a site of detention. It was a crime scene, basically. Although it was a crime scene for the Danish as well. Think of the drug trade. So. Anyway, then, all right, so I want to think about this in relation to the companies that were selling the drugs from grown in India to China, going via Convoys sometimes, but later usually Penang. And the company that did this. First of all, the East India Company, because it was their ships that went out, but also the Danish ships and the British companies alongside the East India Company, like Jardine Matheson. And I wanted to bring this home to London as well to do comparative work. So in London, I found similar groups working on port renovation project, right? In Deptford is a part of London, central London, central South London on the Thames. And there, there's a renovation project, sort of similar, I suppose, I'm arguing in some ways, to the one in Serampore. Right? So getting people from Serampore to talk about the police tanner, and then finding these groups in Deptford who will talk about the development there. And they're a little bit differently oriented. They were interested in a thing called Sayes Court Garden, which is there in Deptford. And it's named, the railway station nearby is called Everley, and it's named after John Evelyn. It's called Evelyn, sorry. John Evelyn, and it was his house that was around which he developed a botanical garden called Sayes Court. And it's very near the port facilities where the East India Company built all of its ships, right? And these facilities, the King's Shipyard, were being renovated by various companies, owned by one, eventually Hutchinson Whampoa. And you'll have heard their name earlier, right? So Hutchinson Whampoa is the company that's inherited Jardine Matheson and P&O and Whampoa and Kowloon Dock Trading Company. They were the ones who built the port in Hong Kong and Canton to receive the opium trade from Serampore. Now, back here in the King's Garden, there's this overdetermined site, right? There's lots of flora and fauna collected from imperialism, from Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake and James Cook. They all sailed from that port, and they came back to that port with various plants from all over the world, and they handed them over to that's how Evelyn built his garden, basically. And it's still there. It's a little bit, I visited in the summer, just gone. I was there in July. June. It's still there. You can visit this mulberry tree that's there from generations and generations of this mulberry tree that's from that time, and several others. I mean, it's much smaller than it used to be. And the manor house is gone because Peter the Great basically wrecked it. he was visiting, before he was Peter the Great, he was just prince, visited from Moscow. And so this site is really something, and there's a plan to redevelop it. So the local community wanted to protect that garden in some sense, and also to open up the space. This space is private and it's locked away from public access, right? So it was used as the shipyards for a long, long time, and then that's all been concreted over. It was used to transport convicts to Australia. It was used as cattle yards. It was used as a staging area for the US assault on the Nazis, Normandy landings in 1943, 44, whenever that was. It was a site for Rupert Murdoch dropping off newsprint when he moved the printing operations of his newspapers from Fleet Street, the traditional site of journalism, to Wapping, with new digital facilities there. And this redevelopment was fast-tracked by current Prime Minister Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London, so that the company Hutchinson Whampoa could rush through a development to build 3,500 condominiums on this site, right? And in a similar way, in Serampore now, the redevelopment of the museums, the government house, and the Tanner, and a pub called the Danish Tavern has led to a surge in building projects of condominiums in the area as well, right? Anyway, this garden, say it's called Garden, right on the edge of the Thames, was historical. It's no longer so big, but there's yards in which the ships, the King's Yard, established in 1513 by Henry VIII, is the Royal Dockyard that built the East India ships, and Queen Elizabeth, who founded the East India Company, or signed the East India Company into existence, knighted Sir Francis Drake on the Golden Hind there, and Captain Cook left from there, and I know Nelson battling against the Spanish Armada left from there, and so many things. And the only bits that are left really are the garden, and it's called Convoys Wharf, a one building that shows it's well, actually there's a bit more. This is a recent front of the building in the site. There was a historical excavation where they dug up as much of the foundations of the old port shipyards as they could, but this is the excavation, historical excavation of the site of the manor house, Evelyn's house, but then they just concreted over it. There's some old maps of the gardens, and I think it's the green part here that still exists. And then there's a 19, so like Tsar Peter was there, visiting William III for a couple of months. Evelyn had a 99-year lease, and the garden states from them. And actually, it's the foundation of the Royal Horticultural Society and maybe even the National Trust, because a member of Evelyn's descendants wanted to preserve it, and they failed to get funding to preserve it. The house, which you saw in the excavations, there's that slide. They wanted to preserve this. This is where it is now. So there must have been more back in the day to preserve it. They didn't get funding for it, but then Octavia Hill set up the National Trust to protect other buildings of significance, not this one. What there is there that exists is this double-sided hangar. You see this M-shaped building. I think it's from around 1910, okay? And you can see that on the site and a few other existing buildings. Sorry, go back. Where is it? There in the overhead shot, you see the doubled roof, right? That's like a really old hangar for the repair of ships inside, and there were these basins, this water area, that's concreted over. You probably see where there are trucks right now next to the building. That would have been a big circle of water. This has all been bought by Hutchinson Whampoa, and they want to develop this, turn it into something like a modern city. This is their first drawing to recognize the port and the building, keep the roof and replace the rest of glass and make it this fantastic thing with lots of people sitting around in the sun. Right, you know, in England there's no sun, right? So anyway, but it looks wonderful. And then these open, amazing towers that look like glass platforms. And this is a design by the designer Terry Farrell for Hutchinson Whampoa. But who are Hutchinson Whampoa? This is what the group in London investigated, and they tracked them to the Kowloon and Whampoa Dock Trading Society. They're a company that made its millions in ports and related services. All right, so in shipping, in building condos, in transportation, electronics, mining, communications technology. They own the 3 network, telephone network, and so on. And they are Farrell's, the developer, proposed this project. And when they were criticised, and in order to get the fast tracking by Prime Minister Johnson, they said, well, we'll protect the Sayers Garden and we'll have a shipping project in the M-Dome thing to restore one of the King's ships called the Lennox. And then their new project was to build 3,500 condominiums, upscale, upper end, really posh places. Definitely historically is a site of working class and low level working class housing, basically, in a large working class community. I mean, mentioned in capital as well. The workers of Deptford are impoverished. Right, this Hutchinson Whampoa though goes back to the very opium traders that were working out of Serampore. So here's the comparative thing: Serampore and London, development in Serampore based on the opium trade, and the London Company and the building of the ships, the East India Company, is now being redeveloped by a company that had already been involved hundreds of years ago in the opium trade, is now, like, was originally run by Jardine, Matheson, Jas Whittle, Douglas LaPrake. He's the like general type guy in the little small photo above the 3, and all these other basically opium traders. And it's now owned by Qiaxing, right? This the gentleman in the suit there, a Chinese billionaire who runs the company, took over the company in the 80s, basically, runs the company out of Hong Kong. It's one of the mega corporations, right? So 3,500 units, some floor space for shopping, 1,800 car park. This is central London, right? So what do you want? 1,800 new cars coming in. All these questions are being raised by the campaign group for Deptford 500 Yuckyard, and they want to build this, the Lennox, to restore the warship, to justify this project. So when we're thinking about comparative turn, there's the group in London is a bit more developed than the Denmark group, but they want to communicate with each other and build up a kind of body of knowledge to work together. And this is still not happening yet, but there are materials for them to do this work. So I'm just putting this up here, some more stuff about the comparative turn approach. But maybe I won't read through this. But the problem is the power dichotomy between those who can do research on urban life in London, and it's more of a thing, and the very difficulty of doing it in Serampore, where the people who are living, who have the local knowledge, are struggling to, like, they're working in stalls outside the development, or they were around another small development called Bill Martin's Pagoda, which is an old temple that's now been renovated as well. They were just young guys. The guys who knew about it were sitting around smoking hashish. They weren't doing the sort of things that you might see the activists types, the local community in London, who, yes, are unemployed, but they're also like on benefits and kind of more activist oriented. Anyway, there are other difficulties. This slide kind of addresses some of that stuff. But what's really interesting is the wall around, the gate that they renovated in Denmark was part of a wall around the Danish compound. But it turns out when you go to the other side of the Thames and see what the East India Company docks, the East India docks in Docklands in London look like, the wall is very similar. In fact, the wall around the pepper warehouse of the East India Company is near identical in structure, right? Now it's been redeveloped as this beautiful cobblestoned area and so on of East India Dock, right? But very similarly shaped, with a similar gate style as the one in Deptford. All of this is interesting because outside of the museum and its very minimal mention of the opium trade, unless you're a local person digging into these matters, you won't find out any of the history. All you'll see is some nice pictures of tea and some exotic images of boats. This was a Shola, no, what was their name? Shonibar, the artist, Walla Shonibar. I forget actually. God, terrible. But this is a kind of commentary on the exotica of the gunships of the British Raj. It's been turned into the exotic sales of textiles from Africa. But the story of the crimes, I mean, colonialism, of course, as such is a crime, but the crimes of opium trade and the turning of rice production into opium and indigo production, which causes famine and starvation, and the destruction of the working class in favor of high-end condominiums in London and soon in Serampore, strikes me as another kind of disruptive narrative that has a great potential to change how we think about anthropology and comparative work. And the thing is how to use some new technologies to get these stories by local communities. Can you stop those doors from slamming, please? Sorry, my train of thought comes to a stop at the end because, right, we need other people to take up the story and technologies to facilitate that. But also we need funding for that to happen and for it not to be controlled by the institution in the same ways as it usually is, or by the same people, one would think. And all of these are ongoing problems, still to be solved, still to be resolved, probably never to be resolved and solved properly, but let's keep them on the boil because it's telling stories like this so we can learn from their terrible history and maybe avoid opium wars, or wars, or the destructions of colonialism again. Who knows?